Thanks everyone for coming. I am Tana, and I'm here to talk about how we made mini motorways. So, who am I? This is me. This is a bunch of stuff I do. I'm at Dinosaur Polo Club, obviously. Worked on mini metro, worked on mini motorways. I'm into voxel art and longboarding and Lindy Hop's swing dancing. And I made Shape. That came out last week. That was pretty exciting. It's free and you should go play it. So that's enough about me. This is the game we're here to talk about today. That's straight from YouTube, so it's not a deja vu. Who doesn't know about mini motorways? Right, cool. This is for you. Yeah, it's a game. You draw roads, you make cars go around. It's pretty neat. It's made in Unity, which you'll learn about a lot. But it doesn't look like a typical Unity game in that it's 2D and we have one scene. But this came out on Steam the other week and has done very well. I'll take the applause. Thank you. But anyway, what is this talk about? So today I want to cover and share the experiences of tools dev at Dinosaur Polo Club, as well as kind of present ideas we have around how we make tools for the entire team and not just the programming team. And I also want to cover stuff like what we would do differently. So to kind of preface the entire talk, this is from the experience of a reasonably small team, but we are small enough that we don't have a dedicated tools developer, but big enough that the people making the tools are different to the ones using them sometimes. So we're in that awkward growth niche that isn't around for long, but is still good to document and talk about. So hopefully there'll be something for a little bit of everyone, and if not, I have some recommendations of what you can do afterwards anyway. So this is a rough things of what I'll cover. I'll cover the tool set we had at launch. That's mainly for context, so you can see how much we've improved it since then. The DPC tool framework, which is pretty exciting, and I'm excited to talk about that. Then processes, what we do for tools dev, considering we don't have dedicated tools developers. And then just things we do differently or things we've improved in our time since launching. So our toolkit at launch was kind of sad because we had about 10 months to make the game, which is not a lot of time to make a game. And because of that short time budget, a lot of our tools were made very quickly, but some of them still stuck around. But there's still a lot we can learn from kind of reflecting on these tools at the time. And the main thing is just how to make tools really quickly. So one of the earliest tools we had in mini motorways was painting maps so that you can see where buildings spawn. And the idea is pretty simple. A designer can specify what tiles, because mini motorways is on a tile grid, are allowed to spawn certain buildings. So an S means a house or a supply, and a D means a destination or a demand, and the C is like where buildings are allowed to upgrade. I drew these C's and D's and S's, and they've just persisted. No one's changed them. And the alpha of each tile indicates how it weights. So if it's more solid, then it's more likely to spawn there. And then you just have this for every single color of group in a city. So on top of that, we also have tiles for density. So we can control how closely things spawn next to each other based on the tiles you can see there. So like the really big chunky checker means it's a bit spaced out, and the tiny ones mean they're close together. On top of that layer, we have trees. So whenever we have a tree in the game, it's actually just data that we place down onto a tile set, then that's populated into the game when it's loaded. And then we layer on top things like where you aren't allowed to draw roads, or where you draw a road will require a bridge or a tunnel. as well as areas that we don't want buildings to spawn because they can get real awkward in some places. And once they all come together, they make this monstrosity, which when we add code to it, does pretty things. And the idea is pretty simple as far as tools go, because essentially all it is we stole the Unity tile map system and we just use it as a 2D visual data store, essentially. So, for example, the S means supply, and we put that into a tile map. We just have it as a tile. We attach data to that tile so that when we load the prefab and pull all the data into a nice spot, it's all we need to take is the position and the tile weight and what it belongs to. But on the designer's end, you get this beautiful, visual, easy way to paint things. Typically, you're meant to use tile maps for this thing. Painting environments, does lots of nice stuff with like collision. This is a great game, by the way. There's a little prototype where it was an auto battler. Someone published me. And then we use it in a weird way. And that's kind of the whole point of what I'm trying to say here, is just leverage your engine in whatever way you can if you need to make tools quickly. Tile maps weren't made for that, but we did it anyway, because this allowed us a lot of benefits, like just getting to the minimum viable product really, really quickly. And sure, we can come back to it later and make a nice, lighter weight tool, but we haven't needed to so far, so it's kind of worked out. And it means you're not spending time making the full version when you didn't need to in the first place. And lastly, it allows for iteration. Iteration is real important on tools because when you're designing the tools and designing the game at the same time, you don't know what you want yet. So if it costs you very little to make a tool, it also costs you very little to get rid of it if you don't need it in the end. Because ideally, the people using your tools are in the same room as you, and this is a really rare opportunity where you can iterate things on this really, really tiny cycle, where you can try something out, go give it to your designer, and then they tell you it's bad. And that's okay, because it only took you 20 minutes. So another tool we had at launch was Debug Actions. These aren't special, everyone has them. You just have a key press, and that maps to something stupid, like giving you 100 points or whatever. But we have a lot of cool tools in many motorways, like the ability to replay an entire game through a journal. And we wanted our debug actions to be able to plug into that journal so that when we are mucking around and you find a bug, all of your journal actions will get logged and the deterministic simulation doesn't muck up because you made the cars go 10 times faster. But this did mean that all of our debug actions had a really high weight to create them. It wasn't just if input dot spacebar, it was attach the spacebar to this action, which is a new class, and then register that as a action of some kind, and then disallow that for shipping builds and all this kind of stuff. But on the whole, it just made adding what should be a simple debug key quite difficult. And it was great. It let us ship. It wasn't great long term, it didn't scale, but it's a great segue into the DPC tool framework. So I'll explain this with a picture because these words mean nothing. But this is what our entire tool suite at DPC looks like, outside of a couple of exceptions. And the idea is pretty simple. We just have DPC editor tools. It's a big old window that contains all of the tools you might want to use and just lets you toggle off the stuff you don't. And this entire framework is really nice for lots of different reasons. It abstracts away lots of common behavior like dependency injection and gives you access to an active game if there is one. So creating a tool doesn't take that long anymore. It also acts as a unified location for all of your team members to look for tools. So if they're like, how do I do this? You just say, open up the only window you have available and find this tick box. On top of that, you can drag them out as individual windows. You can customize it however you like. And I think it's great. I'm a fan. it takes away all of that boilerplate of setting up new tools and just makes it a really smooth process to set up. And in a sense, this framework is tool development for tool devs. And being able to set up tools easy is great, but it's the kind of culture you build around having a tool suite like this that's really sweet. And like I was saying before, it becomes a unified point where you can just point stuff to for anyone in the team, anyone that's working in an engine. So artists can find their scenario editing tools and save game tools, and designers can find the challenge tools and simulation constants, and programmers can find the mock debug tools. And they're all just referenced in the same spot, so you don't have to hunt around menus like when you download a bunch of different plugins and they treat windows and tools as separate things, and it just becomes a mess. And so, for example, with pull requests that we do, it's really easy to be able to reference a tool. You say DPC editor plugin, DPC editor tools, you say play a profile debugger, hit this button, and that'll allow you to test stuff really quickly. And on top of that, we also have things like the simulation constants, which are kind of a different paradigm for how we do data storage, because all of this is just data stored in a scriptable object for those familiar with Unity, and then we just reference that as a window. So again, you don't have to search around the project, there's just the one spot for it. Another tool we have that is a subset of that tool is the in-game tools, and these are one of those really powerful ones that just allow you to control the entire simulation, essentially. You can place destinations, turn them around, delete them. You can turn off upgrades, give yourself unlimited upgrades, all that kind of good stuff. And again, this is all just in one spot. And on top of that, this was our solution to the debug actions I was telling you about earlier, because you don't have to remember a bunch of random keys on the keyboard. They're all just listed there. They're all easy to reference, and they have debug keys anyway, which is pretty handy. They also do stuff like showing gizmos. So on the bottom left, it's previewing where you would place a destination, which is miles better than our debug actions before that. There's just so much good stuff in there. But again, what's awesome about this is that it takes away all of the boilerplate that it was required to make those debug actions from earlier. All you have to do is copy-paste the framework from someone else, paste it in, just do the bit you care about, and you don't have to worry about all of that stuff like assigning it to a key, finding out that that key's already in use, finding a different key, looking through the bunch of stuff. So for example, this is the entire code required to create that nice little UI there to add a bunch of points. I used this the other day to get a high score on Mexico. It was great. And what I'm trying to convey here is to just, I know we all, as tool devs, want to make game development easy, but I feel like we don't focus enough on making tool development easy. Often tools aren't made because the manual process seems like, oh yeah, it won't take this long to take all these screenshots. And then you have to do it 50 times, and suddenly you didn't think about that at the start, that you'd have to do it 50 more times. So you just don't make the tool and you just do the manual process. But it's basically always worth the investment. But I also don't just want to talk the talk, literally. I want everyone to have an easier time to making tools. So for any Unity devs, I have put the really stripped down version of the DPC editor framework up on this thing. The QR code will be available at the end, and I'll put it on Twitter as well. But that is all there for people to be able to just download this and start making tools without having to deal with how does editor GUI layout work? How do I make a new window? How do I decide what hierarchy the window should go in? I personally use this in Shape. So you saw the one before, this looks basically the same, but with all of my custom tools. So for example, the debug physics tool, it started out as the physics tool, but I just put more stuff in there. This was really useful before I even set up my UI. I could start playing with my game elements. This thing here, I haven't made like a level-based puzzle game before, and this thing was insanely useful because the left button would just launch you into the puzzle without having to navigate there, and the other button would just open the prefab, which made iteration incredibly quick. And then I had my real basic build system, which I'm not going to talk about because it's nothing special. But yeah, all of that stuff is really cool and has helped develop a lot of our processes at Dinosaur Polo Club as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have dedicated tools devs in our studio, and larger studios do, so this will be less applicable. But for everyone else, this is kind of what we do to get tools made in the studio. So because we don't have people dedicated to it, we instead dedicate time. And there are two core tool time allocations that we have. So we have these things called stampedes, that's what they're called internally. Lab days, hack days, upskilling time might be what they're called elsewhere. And in these days, tool exploration is encouraged. It's like, if it's going to make your time easier or make someone else's time easier and it wasn't quite enough to justify going into the sprint, then this is the time to do it. We also dedicate like a sprint a day, a sprint on tools, not just for making new ones, but for maintaining existing ones, because that's always taxing sometimes. And when we have looked forward enough at some of our content, we plan for tools to be made from the get-go, which is awesome. And then there's stuff like me, because I'm a programmer kind of designer, where there are overlap, where I'm also the one using the tools and also communicating with the people using the tools. And these are all different ways that we allocate time for tools to be made in the studio. So, other thing I want to talk about is tools empathy. And there's another great talk about this later on. I'll show it later. You can see it there, Darren. But what this is mainly about is just communicating with the people using your tools. And the huge advantage of the DPC editor tool framework is that everyone's using the same tools, which means you'll more quickly catch issues because the people that would fix them are also the people using them. But there's like a bunch of times where I was in this role initially where I didn't have tool empathy, and this is an example here, where I was like, sweet, it would be cool if we could like paint tiles like in Photoshop. So I like did all this work, and it's not that useful. You don't need that level of, or you need more granular control over individual tiles because the resolution is just too small. And this is just an example of, I thought it would be a good idea, but I also don't paint tiles, so. And making that gap between the people that make it and the people that use it as small as possible is really important. Now I want to talk about improvements we've made and things we've learned along the way. So we've done a bunch of updates for Mini Motorways since it launched in September 2019, and here are some of the things we did. This one seems obvious, but is never obvious at the time, of just make tool dev easier sooner so that you get more tools over the long time. You know, it's that if you have the framework sooner, your tools will get made. I can imagine the graph in my head, but I'm not going to try and explain it. Tools over time, stonks go up. Yeah, things like tools to mimic third-party software so that you don't have to actually work with third-party software. That kind of stuff's great. And what I want to say here is that temporary tools are okay too. If you use a tool and it saves someone a week, but it only took you a day to make, but it will never get used again, that's still awesome. Do that all the time. What else we got? Tool prototyping. This one I have mixed opinions on because with the tile painter I was talking about earlier, I should have prototyped that, but it also kind of worked out. But I would probably still lean towards prototype your tools instead of just implement what makes sense at the time. But it's probably, I don't know, this is a case-by-case basis. So getting roles involved sooner was something that we very much didn't do during the launch of Mini Motorways. We had a bunch of stuff which was all programmer-driven and not artist-driven. And kind of the core thing here is just that first one of make the game easy to work on for others. So for example, we had a bunch of animations that were driven by code and like equations and stuff. And so we realized this was bad, and we really went to the effort to make sure that we converted it all to use Unity's animation system so that artists can just get an engine, make it perfect, and make it work. And it also means, like, for another example is the simulation constants. By storing that outside of code, it means you don't have to recompile it every time you change the speed of a car. And the selfish way I look at this is that anything you can turn into a tool is something you can hand off to a designer or an artist and you don't have to do. This is another one that's kind of come up as we've got a larger tool suite of just that people can forget how to use things, and it makes sense. Like, they haven't used the tool in like last time you did a balance update, for example, and that can be like months apart. So, and as the programmers who are making the tools, we kind of do remember how they work because we spent a lot of time debugging them and making them work. So if you have the capacity, like, run refresher workshops that are just like, here's all the stuff we have available. If you want things to change, those are good too. And something I intend on doing as well is just including general how to use Unity tips. There's just a bunch of like tiny things which people are like, oh, that's neat, and then they forget about it. But it would save them a bunch of time, like locking the inspector. That one's great. Another thing we're trying to do more of is to just seek out suggestions and improvements instead of just waiting for something to get so bad that people complain. So, because a lot of people, it depends on the person, but a lot of people just make do with what they have, and once they've got it into a workflow that's like super painful and super long, but they know how to do it, so they just keep doing it. But if you can go sit with your designer and your artist and see what their pipeline is and see how you can make it better for them, they'll love you forever. And often the programming team can seem too busy because programmers are always busy. So if you can make yourself more inviting to suggest things to, those are good too. At the very least, if you ask, we can put it in the backlog and get to it later. I know producers won't like that term, but it's fine. Another thing we really want to improve that we've done like the bare minimum of is just making easy reference guides for usability. So like what I was saying before about we have all of these tools and a bunch of them do a bunch of cool things, and they have hotkeys there, which means you can quickly find out what hotkey was doing what. But it's not perfect. And there's definitely some improvements we can do, and sometimes they're really basic things. Like we had a big list of all the different features, so you can toggle different things on and off, which was awesome. Love that framework. But it wasn't alphabetized, which made things really hard to find. And I got a lot of compliments once I made it alphabetical. So just do stuff like that. It's worth the investment. Make everyone else's lives easier. Yeah, we covered a lot of stuff in 23 minutes. I'm not going to go through every single point again. I just kind of put them there as a reference list. But hopefully something resonated with you, or something was useful. Maybe the idea of tools devs for tools is like one of those things that clicks for you, or the idea of technical design is interesting. Or maybe it was just cool seeing the mini Motorways tool suite. But hopefully something was useful. If not, I've got suggestions. The Frog Detective Project Tour, that was awesome. Highly recommend that. I'll post these slides on Twitter later. Empathy.png, that's tomorrow at 12. Recommend that one. Tech Design in a Nutshell, that looks neat. I'm going to go to that one. Life of a 2D Artist. I kind of recommended this one on the idea that if you, like I was saying before, go sit with your artists, see how they work, do that kind of thing. That one's later on today as well. And yeah, thanks for listening. I think we have time for questions. I'll check the question-y thingy. But if anyone had any, otherwise I think we're good. Yeah?
In your framework, is it easy enough? So in your framework, is it easy enough for artists to make their own
Yeah, so the question was, in the framework, is it easy for artists to make tools as well? And at the moment, it is basically you copy paste a file and then do the codey bits. So it is still code that you have to write. It's a neat suggestion, though. Yeah?
Thanks so much for your talk, Brian. I just wanted to know, do you have similar functionality at runtime with the tools that you're making there? So everything's editor-based, right? But if you're making a build, for example, when you're on device, can you have the same functionality?
Yeah, so the question was, can you have similar functionality in a live build instead of just an editor? And at the moment, it's not set up for that. Actually, all of the hotkeys and stuff work in builds, at least for the in-game tool framework. And I know Pete set up some stuff for remote configs, so you could change asset bundles and then download stuff on device. So it's still most powerful in editor, but there are aspects of it which will work in builds. Yeah?
I have an oddly specific question about the tile map. Do you process that into like a reduced format, or do you ship it with that as the done?
Yeah, so the question was, do we ship the tile format stuff or reduce it down into data? We do ship the entire prefab because it's done by prefabs, but we compose it down into data at runtime. So we load in the prefab, look at all the stuff, turn it into useful data, and then it means it's got like a fixed time to launch, and then it's fine after that. Yeah?
What methods of like communication do you use to talk between, say, artists and tool developers to say what you need? Do you like write tickets or
So,
come up with some sort of brief? Or?
so the question was, how do we communicate between teams? Is it tickets or briefs? And it depends. For larger tools, we've had briefs written where it's like, these are the things we'd like to do. Can you make that happen, please? And then other times it's just an offhand comment of like, I wish this was alphabetized. I'm like, well, go do it. And it takes you like 5 minutes, and then they're out, and they're like, holy crap, I can't believe you did this. I've been struggling with this for months. Yeah?
You said everything was in one scene. So with your different levels, are those all like different tile maps, or are they like some other prefabby thing?
Yeah, so the question was, are all of the different levels in prefabs, or like the tile map data? And yeah, so we have one prefab for each city, and it's, I don't know if there's much more to
Are they
explain.
all like a tile map in themselves?
Oh, right, yeah. So I guess I can flip back to the slide, but basically, oh God, it's right at the start. Animations. So basically, for example, in this one, this is actually 2 tile maps overlaid over each other. One tile map for the supply, one tile map for the demand. Then you multiply that by 6, which is like the max number of colors you can have for a thing. Then you add 1 for density, 1 for trees, 1 for bridges, 1 for tunnels, 1 for you can't place roads, 1 for you can't place buildings. And then it looks like that. So it's a lot of tile maps.
So, sorry, I should have said, are they like a tile grid? That's the big one.
Yeah, so they're all in one grid. I think we have one more question? Or no more? Yeah?
You seem to sort of invite feedback from designers. Like how, like in practical terms, you actually go about doing that?
Yeah, so the question was, how do we practically invite feedback from designers? I pester them. I will go over to Neve and say, hey, need any tools? But we also have, we actually do have a like tools-specific backlog of just like, I wish this was easier, and then type it in, and then when Tools Day rolls around, it's like, oh yeah, this one looks fun, pick that up. This will make someone's life easier. There's probably more stuff we do, but I can't think of it right now. Cool. Thanks for coming, everyone.